Hey everybody, it's Daniel here from Infress. Hope you're all doing well. So we got to talk about this very interesting article here. It's titled Canadian Banks Are Pushing for the Bank of Canada to Remove Shelter Cost from CPI. Basically telling you that the cost of housing is not important to consider when it comes to CPI and that we should remove this because already inflation is to the 2% target, or at least close to it, when we remove shelter, mortgage cost, interest costs, rent, etc., your housing costs out of the equation, because that's not important, right? That's not a big basket of individuals' expenses. It doesn't matter. Those are not, we should not consider that in the inflation report and in terms of how consumers are feeling. Let's just remove this line item so that we can fluff up the numbers the way we want. So that why? So we could get rate cuts. That's why. So I'm going to share this article with you. I'm going to share my screen actually. And I'll put the link in the description so you could read up on it as well. And here we go. So here it is. Canadian banks are pushing for Bank of Canada to remove shelter costs from CPI. So why are they doing this? What's going on, right? Canadian banks are releasing reports one after the other, urging the Bank of Canada to stop using components of shelter inflation in its core CPI calculations. I mean, why should shelter costs needed to live be part of a critical cost of living index? They argued that mortgage interest is not included in US CPI and should therefore not be included here in Canada, but they leave out one important point. Americans can write off their mortgage interest or get a huge flat rate deduction instead. So you have a couple of banks like National Bank come out. You've got TD Bank come out, right? Discuss this, push reports out, right? And I'll link this in the description so you can click on some of these reports, right? If you click on these links here, you can see here's a National Bank report talking about this issue, right? All provinces have CPI X shelter at or below 2%. If we just simply remove shelter, of course it does, right? Same thing if we go here, TD Bank, February 2024 report, discussing the same thing here. High shelter inflation is the single biggest factor preventing Bank of Canada from achieving its 2% target, saying that you don't need it. Bank of Canada's shelter inflation is the problem. No, TD, you're the problem pushing out this narrative and BS. So let's move on. Let's go on in this article. It says for National Bank in their March 19th report titled "All Provinces Have CPI X Shelter at or below 2%." The National Bank writes, "We note that CPI inflation outside shelter was only 1.3% in February, with 9 out of 10 provinces at 2% or below. CPI X shelter is exactly what you think it is. They took out all shelter costs to show, look, we beat inflation." Of course you do. Of course, if you take out the most important component that majority of Canadians feel the pain on, and especially with the housing sector being quite hot and the prices are quite up there, if you take that out, obviously you're going to manipulate and make the data look better, right? That's like giving trophies away, not giving trophies for first place, second place, third place, but giving trophies for everyone for just participating and saying they're all first place winners, right? It's the same thing. You're just manipulating the way the data looks like by taking certain components out, and it doesn't fit the narrative, and it actually harms the consumer even further down the road, because it just simply means, what does this mean? First of all, when you take out and you strip these components, right, national bank, TD, it simply means you don't give a shit about the consumers. That prices are high, people are feeling the pain. You don't give a shit because you worry about more of your bottom line, your bonuses, and all you care about is rate cuts to happen and rates to go down lower so that possibly you don't implode or screw up in hitting your bottom line or your targets. It's just BS. Now, of course, there's risks to tightening, as we've seen in the previous videos I talked about, and when it comes to recessions and so on. But taking that component out doesn't help anyone either. Trying to fool people out there doesn't help anyone either. Not addressing the problem, the shelter component, doesn't help anyone either. Addressing the housing issue in Canada doesn't help anyone either. So anyways, moving on. That's perfect for human beings who don't need shelter. So yeah, if you don't need shelter, let's remove it. I mean, what human being doesn't need shelter? Did we not forget Maslow hierarchy of needs? All right, let me pull that out. Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? They teach this in school. And they teach this in school. There's this full triangle here talking about the needs of an individual, right? You need psychology needs, right? Which is food, water, warmth, rest. Safety needs, security and safety. Belongingness, love and needs, right? There's another one where it talks about shelter here. There you go. The very first basic pillar of Maslow's hierarchy of needs: water, food, shelter, bare necessities for human survival. And the bank's like, it's not important. Shelter, food, water, these things, grocery prices are going up. It's not to worry about that. Let's start cutting rates. And I'm going to get into what this means for the future. But let's move on, talk about, get in more details in this article here. It says, they then proceed to provide a link to another one of their reports showing how shelter is contaminating inflation measures. Look, inflation can be so much lower if we just simply remove the damn shelter component. Blah, 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 blah. It's important to understand that in the National Bank report, they're referring to rent, heating, insurance, and mortgage costs, etc. All basically everything that's very important. And if you look at, many Canadians out there, many of them, 40% of what they make, 50%, some 60% and more, of their income goes towards shelter. So if you're removing it, I mean, what are you trying to do? I don't understand. All shelter costs, not just mortgage interest costs like TD Bank coming next refers to. Rent contaminates the consumer price index. That's a head scratcher. Yeah, it is for sure. They go on to add there is a risk that the Bank of Canada is already doing undue damage to the economy by maintaining an overly restrictive monetary policy. The reason why there needs to be damage in the economy by maintaining this overly restrictive monetary policy is basically the reason they're doing that is to tame inflation, to get that down. Even though, yes, the metrics may be lagging and so on, but they're doing that to be sure that they don't mess up and get it wrong this time. TD Bank, in their February 2024 report, the Bank of Canada's Shelter Inflation Problem, that's what it's titled. TD Bank economists went as far as to write, if we calculate Canadian inflation using the same weights as the Fed's preferred metric, Canadian inflation would be just at 2.1% year over year. Chart 1. Look at it. We would be definitely at 2% if we adjust according to the Fed's preferred metric. TD goes on to add that this isn't going away no matter how quickly the Bank of Canada decides to cut rates. While we have been arguing for the bank to begin looking through the shortcomings created by shelter inflation and instead focus on the health of the broad economy. It's not just banks. There's certain public figures that are also saying the same thing. David Rosenberg, you can read that later. While it's tempting to simply exclude the inconvenient shelter costs to get the result you desire, doing so is dangerous. Shelter costs are real costs incurred by Canadians to survive bone-chilling cold winters, but they think it's not important for you. Shelter is not simply a nice to have. Thankfully, the Bank of Canada understands this and has not caved to the pressure. But guess what? They can. They definitely can, and it's possible they may. They may follow the same way the U.S. Fed talks about their favorite metric of the core CPI X shelter, saying that we're focusing on core CPI X shelter. That doesn't mean anything. So what's the takeaway from this? Takeaway is the banks are pushing. The reason they're pushing these reports is because they're pushing for rate cuts. Eventually, the Bank of Canada is going to cave in to those rate cuts. If there is no recession, if we do get a soft landing, no landing, whatever people are projecting, and you're getting those rate cuts and the economy's doing fine, then taking out the shelter component, making inflation look lower, is not going to help any Canadians out there. It's going to make the situation worse, because when rate cuts come in, and when you have Bank of Canada, which also mentioned that they plan to do easing, quantitative easing next year, and you have the government of Canada stimulating the mortgage market, the housing market, by pumping money there, all it's going to do is increase prices. And the data is just going to tell you that no, prices are fine. When reality, the truth is, it's not. And you can see it in the grocery prices. And you will see it down the road when housing prices move back up again, because of the amount of easing, money printing, and so on. And the currency for the Canadian dollar will depreciate significantly, meaning the wages that you earn will be able to buy less goods and services because of taking out the CPI, because now we took out because taking out the shelter component from the CPI, making the CPI look low, making Bank of Canada going out there to cut rates, ease next year, causing this price increase in housing and other goods out there again. What's going to happen when they start cutting rates? It's going to bring in euphoria, demand, and so on. You can already hear on TikTok and everyone, all the realtors out there talking about rate cuts are coming. And as soon as they come, you better buy those houses. It doesn't help anyone, especially if you remove the shelter component. It's going to move up higher. And the banks don't want that, because they want to run and operate their business well enough for themselves and not for you. So the trajectory of where this is going and the path is that it's not looking good in terms of for anyone who holds currency and cash. Cash will become completely useless and continue to be useless down the road. It will get ugly. Asset prices will go up. And this is when you will hear the term come out more and more. The rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and in fact, I would like to even add that middle class getting worse off and worse off. Even the middle class dropping into the poor category, especially if they don't have much assets and them working for cash, running for cash, cash, while the wages not increasing at the pace of many of these assets from the pumping and the cutting and the easing. Right? When you look at the rate of these assets that will go up in price versus the wages and the cash and the currency value depreciating, it will leave the common person worse off. You want to go on vacation, right? If you're, let's say you want to go to the US today, a dollar US, convert that to Canadian dollars, is $1.30. Down the road, it could be $1.40, $1.50, $1.60. It will require more dollars just to buy a dollar of US. So, anyways, interesting article here. We'll see how things play out in the coming months and years. Let me know what you guys think. Leave a comment below, subscribe, hit the like button, bell icon to be notified on the next video, and I'll see you guys around. Cheers.